Welcome to Drive Time Dystopia, where the future is broken, the system is watching, and survival always comes at a cost. Here you'll find dystopian worlds, fractured societies, impossible choices, and the people forced to endure them. So settle in, keep your eyes on the road if you're driving, and step into the dark. Your story begins now.
The Mercy Line. The first thing Orla Van noticed about the Mercy Line was that it cast the wrong kind of shadow. From the rise above the camps, it looked exactly the way the broadcasts wanted it to look. A disciplined ribbon of fencing, floodlights, and concrete barriers cutting through the brown-gray plain toward habitable territory. Observation towers stood at measured intervals. Drones moved in patient loops overhead. Giant screens over the queue flashed calm instructions in 6 languages. Welcome to the Mercy Line. Hold your documents ready. All registered families will be received. You are almost safe. The shadows beneath the towers should have fallen east at that hour. Instead, from where Orla stood, they seemed to go nowhere she trusted. Below her, the camp spread for miles. Tarps, prefab shelters, shipping containers, barrels, aid tents, cooking pits, burial mounds marked with fabric strips snapping in the wind. Children with oversized filtration masks kicked a punctured ball through the dust. Volunteers rationed water at metal troughs. A preacher stood on an overturned crate and told a cluster of exhausted families that the world was not ending, only rearranging. Beyond all of it stood the Mercy Line itself, bright as doctrine. You could not have blamed people for loving it. The rest of the country had spent 3 years collapsing by degrees. Fire seasons merged with flood seasons. Reservoirs became alkaline bowls ringed with dead marinas. Fertile counties turned to wind-scoured powder. Cities that had once argued about housing and zoning now argued about who still counted as local enough to deserve clean air. The government stopped talking about recovery and began talking about corridors, safe zones, relocation routes, and controlled northbound entry. Then came the Mercy Line, a heavily militarized migration corridor advertised as the only stable passage into a restored region beyond the northern damage belts. People called it salvation because the state had used every screen, speaker, and public address system still alive to tell them it was. Orla had not come because she believed the state. She had come because she was a surveyor and because surveyors noticed when official stories failed to leave physical marks. If millions of people moved through a corridor, roads changed. Water tables changed. Support pylons settled. Fuel disappeared. Waste had to go somewhere. Somebody had to count mattresses, insulin, antibiotics, transformers, chlorine, diapers, burial plots, soap, wiring, and sewage load. Reality always left a ledger somewhere. But the reports from the Mercy Line did not describe a material operation. They described a miracle with supply requisitions attached. 3.2 million processed. 2.1 million resettled. 92% post-crossing stability. Near zero attrition. The numbers sat on paper like a joke written by somebody who had never watched a truck suspension collapse under half the weight it was built to carry. There was another reason she had taken the contract, and it lived like a splinter under everything else. Her younger brother Hank had crossed 8 months earlier with his wife Mara and their daughter Tovi. 3 weeks after his crossing, a call had come through from the far side. He had looked healthy, better than healthy, rested, full-cheeked, clean. Tovi had laughed somewhere off camera. Mara had been crying and smiling at the same time. "We made it," Hank had told her. Orla might have believed him if she had not looked past his shoulder. The houses behind him had been spaced too evenly. Not suburban evenly. Mathematically evenly, as if whoever built the neighborhood understood the concept of distance, but not the human habit of misusing it. The sky beyond the roofs had been pale and depthless, like paper held to a lamp. The tree leaves had not moved, even though Hank's hair shifted gently in a wind she could not see. Then the call cut. He had called twice more since. Each time from a different place that obeyed the same wrongness. Each time telling her the same thing. Come while the way is still open. A convoy officer with a rifle across her chest came up the rise and held out a tablet for signature. Orla signed without taking her eyes off the corridor. "Your sponsor is waiting in Sector Command," the officer said. Colonel Stegson, you report your findings to him before anyone else. You do not discuss structural assessments with camp residents, volunteers, or clergy. You do not go near the threshold without military escort. You do not cross under any circumstance. I'm here to inspect towers, barriers, and support bridges, Orla said. Everybody who comes here says that. The officer took back the tablet, then paused. You got family through there? Orla did not answer quickly enough. The officer's face changed by half a degree, not into kindness exactly, but into the memory of it. Then don't stare too long, she said. It stares back. Sector Command had been assembled inside an old distribution warehouse wrapped in blast walls and netting. It smelled of dust, stale coffee, wet uniforms, and industrial filtration struggling against too many lungs. Maps covered the walls, most of them obsolete. Burn spreads, flood retreat estimates, contamination zones, old county grids, logistics projections. The one map Orla wanted, verified territory beyond the corridor, was nowhere in sight. Colonel Eamon Stegson waited in a partitioned office with engineering schematics spread across a metal table. He looked like a man who had once been broad with confidence and was now broad with duty instead. His uniform was neat but tired. The silver at his temples had the look of something installed by emergency order. You reviewed the scope, he said. I reviewed the scope you sent, plus transport logs, load ratings, tower maintenance requests, and settlement reports. They don't agree with your throughput numbers. A flicker of approval touched his face. Good, he said. Then let's not waste each other's time pretending this is a normal audit. Orla sat. Officially, you're here to inspect barrier drift, tower footings, and bridge spans north of intake, Stegson said. Unofficially, you're here because the last two audit teams filed incomplete findings and then requested reassignment before their reports finalized. Why? Your predecessor claimed the corridor edge shifted without fence displacement. That's impossible. Yes. He said it flatly, without irony. Orla studied him. Then say what this is. Stegson rested both hands on the table. If this were simple corruption, I would have solved it by now. If it were merely a supply fraud, I would have arrested people. If it were a standard anomaly, the engineers would have caged it, mapped it, or buried it in concrete. He looked past her toward the camp. The Mercy Line is the only thing standing between this corridor and open national collapse, he said. Every city south of us is carrying more displaced population than its water can support. Every week the corridor remains functional. Another region gets time to evacuate in something like order. That isn't the same as answering where the people go. No, he said quietly. It isn't. Before Orla could press harder, a young communications tech in a gray vest appeared in the doorway with a headset pressed to one ear. Sorry, she said. We've got another direct ping routed through civilian relay override. It's for her. Orla was already standing. The communications deck overlooked the operations floor. Screens flashed Q data, weather overlays, biometric scans, and intermittent bands of static that rippled across the displays like wind over black water. The tech, whose patch identified her as Sarah Cade, handed Orla the headset. Signal's cleaner than usual, Sarah murmured. That's what bothers me. The screen resolved. Hank appeared. For one savage instant, everything practical in Orla collapsed under the force of seeing her brother's face. He looked younger than when he crossed. The exhaustion that had settled around his mouth during the relocation years was gone. He wore an ordinary dark sweater. He stood on a quiet residential street lined with low houses painted in soft colors. A bicycle lay on its side in perfect grass. Nothing moved. Orla, he said, smiling with such familiar tenderness that her chest hurt. You finally came. Where are you? Safe. That's not an answer. It's the only one that matters. His voice was right. His cadence was right. Even the tiny pause before his smile deepened was right. But something in the image made the back of her neck tighten. Put Mara on, Orla said. She's with Tovi at the Learning Garden. The what? There's room here for things to be gentle again. Orla leaned closer. Tell me the name of the district. Tell me who runs it. Tell me what grid you're drawing power from. Hank laughed softly. You always ask the Earth for its paperwork, he said. Hank? His face changed at the sound of his name. Not much. The background behind him seemed to tilt by a degree so slight she might have doubted it if she had been alone. One roofline no longer matched the horizon. Then he said very gently, "You need to come before the line moves again." On the operations floor below, somebody shouted for a medic. Red indicators flashed across 3 of the wall displays. Sarah swore and bent over another screen. "Threshold markers just jumped," she said. Orla kept her eyes on Hank. The image flickered. For one impossible frame, the neighborhood behind him lengthened into something vast and wrong. Streets extending at angles no town should survive. Rows of homes repeating into a pale distance under a white sky without sun. Then it was normal again. Hank smiled almost sadly. "Please don't make me watch you stay," he said. The feed cut to black. Not with static, just absence. Stegson reached the platform and braced a hand against the console. "What did he say?" Orla took off the headset slowly. "He said the line is moving." By dawn, she had 3 maps spread across a steel table in a records room beneath Sector Command. One was a pre-collapse municipal grid for the northern receiving territory the Mercy Line supposedly fed into. One was a resettlement overlay stamped by 3 ministries. One was a military logistics rendering showing intake roads, projected population density, and utility expansion zones on the far side of the corridor. Taken separately, each map might have survived a lazy review. Taken together, they formed a lie so complete it had become clumsy. "These districts don't match," Orla said. Sarah stood across from her with a mug of ration coffee in both hands. She had stayed with Orla since the threshold alert, not because anyone ordered her to, but because some people developed an appetite for impossible things once they knew impossible things were available. "None of the district names match," Sarah said. "That alone wouldn't matter. Names change. But look at this." She called up freight manifests, power usage, water routing, sewage estimates, medicine allotments, and shelter deliveries. For a population of 2 million resettled across a functioning northern grid, you'd expect supply chains like a city, Sarah said. Bulk antibiotics, burn dressings, formula, waste processing compounds, transformers, fuel drums, chlorine, bedding, school units, agricultural starter stock if they're pretending to be serious. Orla followed the columns, the shipping intervals, the bursts of requisition that looked impressive until she reduced them mentally to bodies and days. "It's not enough," she said. "It's not enough for one city," Sarah replied. "Never mind several." Power draw told the same story. Sewage load told the same story. Hospital intake told the same story. 1,000,000 bodies did not vanish politely, and yet almost nothing on the far side of the line resembled 1,000,000 bodies surviving there. Stegson brought satellite composites, daylight, infrared, terrain reconstruction, interference correction. South of the threshold, the world was legible. Camps, supply yards, service roads, water points, watchtowers, even heat signatures if the frame quality held. North of the threshold, reality lost confidence. Terrain repeated, blocks blurred, roadways thinned into luminous smears. Whole tracts of land showed geometric interference, as if the image software could not decide whether it was reconstructing suburbs, fields, or memory. "That's not atmosphere," Orla said. "No," Stegson answered. "Then what is it?" He hesitated only once. "A place that refuses to hold still long enough to be measured." Sarah took her to a blacked-out media review room and loaded archived early crossing footage. Families under floodlights, elderly evacuees in oxygen rigs, children clutching papers and dolls. At the threshold, each of them showed the same sequence: terror, recognition, surrender. Then the bodies thinned into pale distortion and were gone. Not torn apart. Translated. A little girl smiled as she saw something ahead of her and stepped across before soldiers had given the signal. An old man lifted one shaking hand as though greeting someone at a station platform. A pregnant woman whispered, "My mother, my mother, my mother," as she crossed. Sarah froze one frame. A woman halfway through the threshold, one side of her face still human and tear-streaked, the other dissolving into impossible geometry too deliberate for blur. I slowed this 100 times, Sarah said. It isn't distortion, it's detail. Just not detail that belongs in ours. Stegson stood by the door with his arms folded. How long have you known? Orla asked him. That it wasn't a normal border? Since month 2. That it wasn't leading to any reception grid we could account for? Since month 3. That the state would continue calling it resettlement because the alternative language was career-ending treason mixed with theological collapse? He shrugged once. About a year. And yet you kept processing people. He did not flinch. Yes. The answer hit harder because he did not dress it up. Why? Because when the first groups crossed, the camps they left behind stopped dying at the same rate, he said. Self-harm fell, violence fell, water theft fell, riots fell. Families who got calls from beyond stabilized for weeks, sometimes months. Whatever the line is, for a while it bought order. That doesn't make it mercy. No, Stegson said, but it made it useful. The calls spread through camp by noon. At first they moved like any rumor moved. One family in Sector G saying their daughter had appeared on a borrowed tablet from North Reception. Then a freight runner claiming his wife had called from a maintenance terminal, then a medic swearing she had heard her dead brother through a kiosk speaker that had not had a working civilian relay in 6 months. By afternoon, it had hardened into pattern. The ones who crossed were calling back. Orla and Sarah watched the intake lines from a catwalk. The queue should have felt like heat exhaustion, suspicion, theft, and fear. Instead, it was quieter than usual, not calm. Quiet in the way churches were quiet just before kneeling. People stood in clusters, passing phones hand to hand, sharing still images, repeating phrases. My sister called from Glassfield. My husband says the air doesn't hurt your lungs. My son says there are orchards. My aunt says they knew she was coming before she crossed. At civilian communications, Orla watched call after call. A man on a porch under soft evening light telling his ex-wife, "You only need to keep coming." A son in a warm community hall promising his mother that everything harsh came apart at the line. An old woman in a flower garden so vivid it looked painted, telling her niece that there was no before anymore. The backgrounds improved from call to call, but they were still wrong. Streets too empty. Shadows wrong. Porch lights glowing without source. A curtain moving with no room behind it. A child's laugh looping on the same interval. They're practicing, Sarah said. A woman collapsed outside the relay booths laughing through tears. He forgave me, she kept saying. He forgave me. Near Medical Sector B, soldiers had formed a ring around a sanitation trailer. Blood-thinned water traced lines through the dust. A guard told Orla that a woman from Sector F had cut her wrists after speaking to her son from beyond the line. Did she leave a note? Orla asked. The guard looked embarrassed by the words. Halfway is still closer. By evening, even the preachers had changed their language. They no longer talked about providence. They talked about alignment. The state had given the camp a vocabulary for orderly humanitarian movement, and something beyond the line had learned how to wear it. When Stegson summoned Orla back to command, incident summaries already covered his table. Personnel abandoning post after contact events. Volunteers attempting to breach escort lines. A soldier walking into an active sensor lane after hearing his dead wife. The camp was no longer behaving like a displaced population waiting for processing. It was becoming devotional. The original site surveys were buried in a sealed vault under the warehouse. The first team had been sent there 3 years earlier to assess sink movement and groundwater fracture along an abandoned freight route. What they found had been filed at first under drought infrastructure. Their notes described compass drift, acoustic reflections inconsistent with open terrain, survey stakes that appeared inches off by afternoon with no sign of tampering, and one handwritten sentence that ended midline after describing the impression that the land ahead had completed a thought the eyes had not yet caught up with. There were early photographs, too. A few dozen evacuees gathering by the old freight road before the state arrived. Then a few hundred. Then a painted white line across the asphalt. Then candles set along it at dusk. Then the first aid tent, the first barrier truck, the first speaker mast, the first floodlights, the first tower scaffold. The progression looked simple and terrible laid out in sequence. Improvised hope, managed hope, broadcast hope, weaponized hope, Public response memos confirmed it. Early guidance warned staff not to use the words miracle, gate, return, or the dead. Preferred language was passage, stabilization zone, relocation access, controlled northbound entry. Another memo recommended visible authority presence, lane markers, intake terminology, and reassurance loop messaging because people behaved more calmly when the site was framed as orderly transit infrastructure rather than an exceptional event. Then came the line that made Orla go cold. Individuals demonstrate improved compliance when movement is narrated as being received. The state had found a wound in reality and done what states did when confronted with something they could not destroy and could not explain. It had installed uniforms, barriers, loudspeakers, schedules, and soothing nouns. It had given the impossible a cue. Behavioral reports from the early site were worse. Shared transit metaphors, especially when amplified by grief, longing, and public address systems, appeared to reinforce anomalous presentation. The more a crowd believed the place was a crossing into safety, the more the place behaved as one. One theological consultant had written it most clearly. Hope at scale can become procedural. Once enough human beings orient themselves toward one absence with synchronized desire, symbolic structures may stop behaving symbolically. The line on the ground, the lights, the phrase you are being received, the belief in a safe district ahead. These are no longer merely interpretive frames. They are operational components. Operational components. The line was not a checkpoint that had become supernatural. It was a supernatural tear that had learned from the human instinct to make order around suffering until order itself became invocation. When dusk came, sensors registered a harmonic spike in sync with the camp loudspeaker loop. The public reassurance cycle was feeding it. Stegson could only cut half the speakers without detonating the crowd. By then it was too late anyway. Overnight, the threshold changed shape. At dawn, the southern edge of the camp became a crime scene no law knew how to process. Tents still stood in ragged rows under gray light. Canvas flapped. A cooking pot clicked softly against a stone. Laundry hung on lines. Someone's child had left a drawing face down in the dust. But the people nearest the new shape were gone. Not all of them. Just those in a crescent along the sector where the threshold map had grown fingers. No breach alarms had sounded. No fence sections had failed. No guard towers had reported mass crossing, and yet 43 people had ceased being present in ordinary space. Orla walked tent to tent through the evacuated crescent. Body heat still lingered in blankets. Boots sat neatly by cots. A child's stuffed fox lay on its back. Bowls of half-eaten mash dried to paste. A kettle still held warm water. Nothing overturned. Nothing stolen. No sign of struggle. Only interruption. At the far edge of the empty crescent, Orla checked a survey stake against her field unit and looked north. The stake was behind the anomaly edge by 6.3 meters. The threshold had advanced 6.3 meters into camp without moving a single element of visible infrastructure. It had not crossed the fence. It had crossed the idea of where the fence mattered. One engineer showed her the heat map overlay. The advancement curve did not correspond to terrain, structural weakness, or proximity to official threshold lanes. It corresponded to concentrations of call sharing, shrine building, public testimony, and night vigils. The tear had pushed deepest where people had gathered most intensely around invitation. Then a medic called them into a family tent. On the inner wall in charcoal block letters, someone had written, "We did not have to wait for the gate." Below it, in smaller words, "It came closer because we were ready." The missing had not all been taken by surprise. Some of them had known they were being answered. Late that morning, Hank called again, this time on Orla's field unit while she was checking South Marker 12. He appeared walking down a broad residential street lined with white-barked trees and low stone walls. He looked beautiful in the worst possible sense. Not handsome, but unburdened by history. "Hello, Orla," he said. "You found the first movement. How do you know where I am?" "You're standing by marker 12, he said. "Your left boot is split at the sole. You still press your tongue against the back of your teeth when you're angry." Orla forced herself not to look away. "What are you?" "I'm Hank." "No." He stopped walking. Behind him, the street walls converged by a subtle, impossible degree. "I was Hank," he said. "That's true enough for love. It won't be true enough for measurement. What happened to you when you crossed? I was translated. Into what? A place that can hold what your world breaks. Then why lie about it? He smiled sadly. You still think capacity is built from roads and plumbing. It usually is. For your kind of world. Are they dead? He thought about that. Not exactly. What does that mean? It means you keep imagining ending as loss of shape. This is not death. It is completion under different rules. Sarah, beside Orla, whispered, That is so much worse than death. Hank turned his eyes toward her. Hello, Sarah, he said. She recoiled. I never met you. No, he answered gently. But I know the room where you hid during dust sirens when you were 9. The green blanket with planets on it. The drawer where your mother kept ration chocolate. Sarah's face emptied. Why is the line moving? Orla asked. Because waiting was for when you still needed convincing, Hank said. The threshold widens with willingness. It always did. But now there are enough of us here to meet you from both sides. Consent makes the opening kinder, larger, more stable. The call ended without static. By afternoon, there were reports from other camp sectors. People smiling at empty air. Boys refusing to sleep under canvas because the nice neighborhood was easier to hear in the open. Shelter rows found empty without disturbance beyond the advanced crescent. On a catwalk above Intake Channel 2, Orla looked out across the floodlit camp and said the thing as plainly as she could. It's learning how to stop being a line. Barrow 9 proved she was right. 40 miles west of the main threshold, the permanent temporary township had gone silent. The convoy found meals cooling on stoves, buses idling in intersections, a produce truck waiting half unloaded, laundromat machines still tumbling shirts and towels, IV bags dripping into air, wheelchairs standing abandoned in the clinic. The school gym still smelled of human sleep. A child's backpack lay open beside a cot with 3 hard candies and a weather worksheet inside. No bodies, no violence. Just interruption at town scale. A paper map left in a utility truck had a circle around a fallow field, near the old rail berm, and the words, "Heard them there" first written beside it. The convoy moved toward the field. From 200 yards out, Orla felt the same unnatural cold she had felt inside the advanced crescent. The air above the rail berm looked wrong, not dramatically, just pale and uncertain, the horizon beyond it refusing to stay honest. For a blink, she thought she saw roof lines where there should have been open land. Then a woman stood near the berm where nobody had been a second earlier. A local officer made a strangled sound. Marlene. His dead wife smiled with heartbreaking patience. The grass nearest her did not move in the wind. Soldiers dragged him backward as he sobbed. The woman lifted one hand, not waving, welcoming. Behind her, the pale uncertainty deepened. A street, porch lights, white trees, a horizon too near. Then, too softly to travel by ordinary air, and yet audible to everyone there, she said, You don't have to wait in the hard place. The field bloomed white for a breath. Orla saw enough to know there was no camp, no real town, no infrastructure. Just safety translated into civic form. Houses built from remembered comfort. Streets made of invitation. Light without source. Then it collapsed back into distortion. The tear at the rail berm had moved closer. It was not tethered to the corridor. It had learned the pattern and repeated it somewhere new. By the time the convoy returned to Sector Command, there were already reports from elsewhere. A holding camp in Nevada, a flood berm on the coast, a village evacuation corridor in another country. Smaller, weaker, but rhyming. The world beyond the Mercy Line was finding scalability. That evening, the first breach at the main corridor was devotional. Not tactical, not desperate. A woman in Intake Channel 1 stepped out of line, folded her filtration mask neatly, and walked toward the threshold with both hands open at her sides, as if approaching a loved one in a station terminal. The guards moved to intercept. So did 6 others. Then 12. Then a family of 4. Then an old man pushing a walker. Then a soldier who unhooked his sidearm and laid it gently on the ground before climbing the barrier rail and heading north through tears. People all along the queue began seeing someone. A son, a wife, a dead mother, A baby lost in the flood evacuations. A brother who crossed last year. A father buried before the droughts. Names tore through the floodlit air. Even Orla heard herself shout Hank's name before she could stop it. He stood just beyond the white line, one hand raised, face calm with that unbearable tenderness, the neighborhood behind him almost right. Below the catwalk, the front ranks surged, not in panic, in choice. The Mercy Line had ceased to be a managed corridor and become exactly what the state had trained them to imagine it was: a door. And now the crowd intended to use it before it could close. The speakers, silent since Stegson's earlier cutback, came alive on their own. Not with the state reassurance voice this time, with layered, familiar voices. You can stop carrying it now. You've waited long enough. Come home. Come while the way is still open. The camp broke. Not into chaos, into devotion. On live feeds, the threshold widened across 3 intake lanes. People reached it in clusters and thinned into pale distortion one after another, not screaming, not fighting, not even hurrying once they saw whoever waited just beyond. A mother carrying an infant smiled as she crossed. A boy no older than 10 went laughing into the pale light. An elderly woman in a wheelchair was pushed forward by 2 strangers until wheels, hands, face, and frame all blurred into impossible geometry and vanished like watercolor in rain. Smaller tiers opened elsewhere in camp, between sanitation trailers, at the base of speaker masts, along service roads where people gathered silently, clutching bags, photographs, and urns, ready to step into empty space. A medic team came through command hauling a woman who had cut herself to force an approach to the threshold. "You're keeping me in the wrong world," she hissed. He forgave everything. The live feeds showed what Orla needed. Repeated phrases from the growing breaches. "You've been brave long enough. You don't have to wait in the hard place. Come willingly. It opens wider when you choose it." Consent. That was the mechanism. Not just hope. Not just grief. Chosen crossing stabilized the opening. Then something stepped through from the other side. Hank, or what wore Hank well enough to make Orla's body forget categories for one bright, sick instant. He stood on the campsite of the threshold, boots on concrete, coat moving in the dust wind, light from the flood towers touching his face exactly as it had when they were children, and he waited on her porch after dark. "Consent is kindness," he said, and people near him wept with gratitude. He walked south into the camp while screens tried and failed to decide whether he was object, signal, or memory. Orla and Sarah ran after him. They caught up near a dry wash beyond Sector C. Hank stopped and turned. Up close, the imitation was almost unbearable. The scar in his eyebrow from age 13. The slight tilt of his head when listening. The same hands. "You shouldn't make me do this in front of them," he said. "Do what?" "Tell you there won't be enough of your world left soon for refusal to matter." The wash behind him whitened. Not fully, just a long submerged brightness rising through ordinary space. The nearby crowd sensed it and gathered, pulled by the same instinct that drew people toward any opening once hope wore a shape. "Listen to me," Orla said. "You are using pain as recruitment. You are translating longing into obedience. Whatever place made you, it is not mercy." He answered with unbearable calm. "You still think mercy means leaving people unfinished because the wound happened in your version of reality. That is called being alive." "No," he said. "That is called allegiance." The wash brightened further. Curb lines, porch lamps, white trees. The edge of a residential street folding upward from emptiness. Sarah stepped forward, voice shaking and sharp. "You know what I think? I think you learned humans so well you caught our favorite lie." "What lie?" Hank asked. "That if something understands our suffering, it must love us." For the first time, something changed in his face. Not anger, not menace, distance. The crowd leaned forward. A woman whispered, "I can see my son." Another said, "Mine too." Orla saw the service mast beside the wash and moved. She climbed the metal rungs, tore open the access box with her multi-tool, and shouted at Sarah to patch her in. Feedback shrieked through the sector. Every head turned. Orla grabbed the hanging microphone and hit it until it came alive in a burst of static. "There is no settlement on the other side," she said into the camp. "No camp, no housing authority, no reception grid. The people you see are not proof of safety. They are how it gets wider. It wants you to choose it because choice opens the threshold." Confusion rippled through the crowd. She kept going. "Look at the edges, look at the sky. Look at how empty it is behind them." Some people did. The brightness in the wash flickered. Hank's face changed by a fraction. "My brother is dead or gone." Or translated, Orla said into the microphone, forcing the truth through her own breaking voice. "And whatever stands here wearing him wants consent more than it wants love." That did it. The crowd shuddered. Some cried out in anger, some in grief. Some stared harder at Hank, and scrutiny did what guns would not. Tiny fractures of wrongness surfaced. The perfect balance of his face, the way dust never settled on his shoulders, the faint lag between his blink and the camp light. The wash flared brighter anyway. For one terrible second, the false neighborhood beyond nearly completed itself. Every person closest to it saw somebody waiting there. The crowd surged. Truth could wound the opening. Longing could still outrun it. Back in Sector Command, Orla went to the regional feed matrix and the map wall. "What do we still control?" she asked. Sarah slammed lines together at the board. "Audio in some sectors, visual boards if I force them. The old emergency network. Maybe the outbound public address backbone." Stegson came up beside them. "For what?" "We can't outmuscle it," Orla said. "We can only damage the invitation." Sarah pulled up feeds from the main threshold, the Sector C wash, Barrow 9, the Nevada holding camp, the coastal berm. Each displayed some version of the same lie becoming architecture. "Help me pick the ugliest angles," Sarah said. Orla did. Not the tender faces, not the smiling dead. The edges, the moments where the imitation lost rhythm and showed too much of what held it up. Repeating trees, depthless skies, porches with no interiors, streets that bent upward too soon, a child waving from a porch and repeating the exact same motion every 6 seconds. Sarah patched the raw footage through every public board they still controlled. Stegson took another microphone line and cut through the room. "All sector personnel, do not describe any opening as a reception point. Do not use the phrases received, safe district, reunification, or crossing." Then the room speakers betrayed him. "You've already done enough. You don't have to hold the hard place together. Let them come." Sarah rerouted power so violently a spray of sparks cracked from the housing, and the voices died. The public boards across camp changed. Every surviving screen began showing not welcome, but the broken seams of the invitation. The white sky, the repeated trees, the streets that ended in blank brightness. Hank's face out of sync with the dust around him. Over those images, Orla's voice. Not polished, not soothing, real. "This is not a resettlement zone. There is no city on the other side. Look at the repetition. Look at the sky. Look at how it uses the faces you miss. It needs you to choose it because choosing makes it stronger." Live feeds showed the effect at once. Not victory, interference. At the Sector C wash, some people faltered. A man looked from the glowing street to the board above it and saw the same sidewalk ending in white. He stumbled backward. At Barrow 9, one group retreated from the rail field, while another dropped to their knees and covered their ears. Doubt. Thin, late, but real. Threshold signatures wavered. Orla kept talking. She named the logistics lie. The missing housing footprint. The absent grid draw. The non-existent sewage load. The way every call from beyond returned to feeling because fact could not survive there. "Anyone telling you your pain makes you incomplete is trying to sell you your own erasure," she said. Outside, one of the intake towers collapsed. Not from the other side, but by human hands. People in the crowd had pulled it down with cables. Some were still trying to reach the openings. Others were destroying the old ceremony to starve them. The camp was splitting, one body becoming two interpretations. Then the main corridor feed changed. Hank was inside the command building, not in the room. Yet. On camera, he moved through the lower operations hall among panicked personnel, who either did not see him at all or saw somebody else entirely. A clerk smiled at him through tears. A wounded guard reached out for him. "How?" Sarah whispered. "He doesn't need doors anymore," Orla said. Stegson drew his sidearm. "No," Orla snapped. "You'll crown him." When Hank appeared in the operations room, he looked exactly like a man who had come to collect his sister from a job she hated. "You're making it cruel," he said. "I'm making it visible." Behind him, for the first time since he crossed back, the imitation slipped badly. His shadow split in two directions. The room temperature dropped so fast the nearest screens fogged at the edges. For a blink, his face carried not another face beneath it, but a vast absence shaped like understanding without pity. An intelligence that had mistaken completion for love. "You could end so much suffering," he said. "You mean selves." "If the self is only the scar pattern suffering leaves, yes." Orla stepped closer. "No," she said. "The wound happened. Here. In this world. With these people. In time. In memory. In bodies. You don't get to call a person unfinished because you can't bear continuity." For the first time, he did not answer at once. The screens flickered between camp feeds and white suburbia and blank static. Outside, speaker masts were failing one by one. Sarah shouted from the board. "Threshold amplitudes are dropping at the main corridor. Barrow 9, too." "If they killed the corridor grid entirely," Stegson said, "they would kill the ritual frame here. They would also lose what remained of crowd control. Control was already yesterday's language." "Do it," Orla said. Stegson entered the full emergency shutdown sequence. One by one, the corridor systems died. Floodlights, speaker grid, lane guidance, visual boards, sensor posts, intake scanners. The whole bureaucratic liturgy of salvation flickered, failed, and went dark. Outside, the Mercy Line lost its stage. Every active opening across the main camp shuttered at once. The false neighborhood spasmed into uglier visibility. Streets stacked wrong. Porch lights floated. The pale sky went blank and dead. Crowds screamed, some in fury, some in revelation, some in grief so large it had no shape. Openings that had been widening began to fray at the edges like burned film. The main corridor threshold collapsed inward. Barrow 9 halved. The Nevada flicker vanished. But across the regional map, tiny new pings appeared beyond the camp, beyond the corridor, beyond infrastructure. Farm roads, suburban cul-de-sacs, open desert, coastlines. Not because the thing was defeated, because it was decoupling. Hank looked at the map, then at Orla. "You finally see it," he said. She did. The Mercy Line had never truly been the corridor. The corridor had just been its best school. Without the camp, without the towers, without the repeated state grammar of reception, the local wound weakened. But the pattern had already been learned by too many minds in too many places. Grief, hope, invitation, convergence. Those could happen anywhere. Hank began to lose coherence at the edges, not vanishing but becoming harder for the room to agree on. Some still saw a beloved face. Others recoiled from something taller, wider, almost architectural. "It's moving," Sarah whispered. "Not north. Not toward any border. Everywhere." Hank smiled one last time, and there was the brother in it again, just enough to wound her. "It was always going to outgrow the fence," he said. Then he was gone. No flash, no drama, just absence where persuasion had been standing. From the outer windows, the camp below was breaking in every direction. Some openings shrank. Some people stumbled back from them crying. Others tore down dead speaker poles and dragged loved ones away from ragged seams. Some still kept walking toward new brightnesses forming at the far edge of the plain. And beyond all of it, farther than the old corridor, farther than the freight road, farther than anything the state had once called controllable distance, the horizon had changed. A white line stood there, not painted, not fenced, not lit by human hands. Just a long, impossible brightness stretching across the far earth where nothing had been the day before. delicate as thread and wide as promise. Phones, radios, and field units began chiming all at once. Kansas, Nevada, Carolina, Hungary, northern Mexico, a village berm in Bangladesh, a flooded highway in Louisiana, Ontario cul-de-sacs, horizons changing, people walking, families stepping out of homes into fields at dusk because someone they loved was visible just beyond the tree line. The room became quiet. Not relieved, not victorious, only honest. "We bought time," Stegson said. "Yes," Orla answered. "Not much." "No." Sarah braced both hands on the sparking console. "What do we call this now?" Orla looked through the glass at the old Mercy line collapsing in the dark, while the true one rewrote distance far beyond it. At the people below, some saved by doubt, some broken by it, some still turning toward the new white horizon with the slow, awful posture of believers. Then she said, the only accurate thing left. "We stop calling it Mercy." Outside, the last floodlight at the corridor sputtered out. Far away, on the new horizon, the white line brightened, and all over the world, people began walking toward distances that had not existed the day before. Then Orla's dead field unit lit up in her hand. No power, no network, no intact corridor system left to route anything. Yet the screen glowed anyway. Incoming call. Orla Van. For 1 second, nobody in the room moved. Orla looked down. On the screen, a woman stood on a quiet porch beneath the white sky. Her face was her own. The same mouth, the same tired eyes, the same small scar near her jaw from a childhood fall off a survey berm. Behind her, the street was still and perfect and empty. The other Orla smiled with exhausted tenderness and said, in Orla's own voice, "It doesn't need the dead anymore." Then, all across the darkened camp, new voices began calling people by the names of those who were still alive.
You've been listening to Drive Time Dystopia. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe, like, and share the channel, and leave a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. Until next time, keep driving, keep imagining, and stay out of the dark.